Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel NPA Discovery. If this is your first time here, thank you for joining us. On this channel, we dive deep into the lives of extraordinary artists, uncovering not only their successes but also the struggles, sacrifices, and hidden truths that shaped who they became. Today, we're exploring the heartbreaking and inspiring journey of Layne Staley, the legendary frontman of Alice in Chains. Many know him as the voice that defined grunge's darker edge, haunting, raw, and unforgettable. But beyond the music, Layne's life was filled with both remarkable beauty and devastating tragedy. Layne Rutherford Staley was born on August 22, 1967, in Bellevue, Washington. The world didn't yet know it, but a boy had entered life who would one day become one of the most defining voices of the 90s. His parents, Phil and Nancy, likely saw an ordinary child at first. But as Layne grew, something about him was different. Even from childhood, Layne felt things more deeply than most. Friends and family recall that he wasn't a child who took life lightly. Every joy was overwhelming, every sadness consuming. That intensity, as beautiful as it was, also foreshadowed the struggles he would face later in life. Layne despised his middle name, Rutherford. In fact, he disliked it so much that he reacted with anger when people used it. As a teenager, he even went so far as to legally change his middle name to Thomas, inspired by none other than Tommy Lee, the drummer from Motley Crue. That decision wasn't just about a name, it symbolized his desire to align his identity with music and with the rock lifestyle he idolized. And indeed, music was in his bones from the very start. At just 2 or 3 years old, he joined a local rhythm band, barely tall enough to hold an instrument. Imagine a toddler, eyes wide, banging away in rhythm while others twice his size tried to keep up. By age 9, in a Dr. Seuss book titled All About Me, when asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, Layne didn't hesitate, he wrote, singer. That detail might sound small, but think about how many kids change their dreams weekly: astronaut, firefighter, teacher. Not Layne. He knew exactly who he was meant to be. Much of Layne's early taste in music came directly from his parents' record collection. While many kids his age might have been listening to bubblegum pop or children's records, Layne was absorbing the darkness, weight, and raw power of bands like Black Sabbath. That band, more than any other, planted a seed that would later grow into the heavy, brooding style Alice in Chains became known for. But he didn't stop with Sabbath. He explored punk, glam, and experimental sounds, bands like Twisted Sister, The Stooges, Ministry, and Skinny Puppy. Each of these left their mark on him. You can almost hear traces of those influences in his later music: the doom of Sabbath, the raw rebellion of the Stooges, the theatricality of glam, and the unsettling edge of industrial sounds. But while music gave him direction, his personal life was anything but stable. When Layne was just 7 years old, his parents divorced. That fracture left a scar on him that never fully healed. His father's absence in particular haunted him. Throughout his life, Layne would often express pain over abandonment, and it became one of the emotional undercurrents of his songwriting. Raised mostly by his mother Nancy and later his stepfather Jim Elmer, Layne tried to adapt. He even briefly used the name Layne Elmer during high school, reflecting the new family dynamic. But deep down, he never stopped longing for the relationship with his father that he didn't have. This longing became a wound that, later in life, made him especially vulnerable to addiction. Psychologists often point out that children of broken homes sometimes carry invisible burdens, feelings of not being enough, or of being left behind. Layne, with his sensitive heart, carried those burdens heavily. At age 12, Layne began playing drums. It was a natural choice at the time, but even then, something wasn't quite right. He had rhythm, he had energy, but his heart was elsewhere. Drumming was safe, but it wasn't his true voice. That voice needed a spark, and it came in the most unexpected way. In 1984, 3 students from Shorewood High School were forming a band. They had guitarists, they had a drummer. What they didn't have was a singer. Enter fate. Layne's stepbrother, Ken Elmer, casually mentioned to the band's drummer that Layne could sing. At first, Layne resisted. Shy and insecure, he told his mother, "Well, I'm no singer." But eventually, he went to the audition. And when he opened his mouth, everything changed. One of the band members later recalled, "The grain of his voice was there. The soul was there. We didn't even know what we were looking for until we heard him." That moment was pivotal. Layne had discovered his instrument, his voice, and with it, the path his life would follow. After that first audition, Layne's world began to shift. He had found not only his talent but also the confidence that came with it. Still, the path forward wasn't smooth. Like many young musicians, Layne had to navigate unstable bands, revolving doors of bandmates, and the uncertain grind of the local music scene. The group that first discovered his voice eventually became known as Sleaze. The name might sound rough around the edges, but that was part of the charm. They weren't polished, they weren't glamorous, but they were authentic. And at the heart of it was Layne, still unsure of himself but clearly destined for something greater. During this period, Layne even had a small role in a low-budget Seattle film called Father Rock. Imagine this shy, lanky kid, still figuring out who he was, suddenly on screen. It wasn't about fame at that point. It was about trying things, experimenting, and seeing where life could take him. What stands out most from this era isn't the band's modest success, but Layne's persistence. Many people, after seeing bands fall apart or not getting recognition, would have given up. But Layne didn't. He kept going, driven by that voice inside, both literal and metaphorical. And perhaps this is a lesson we can all take. Sometimes it isn't the success moments that define greatness, but the ability to keep showing up when the world doesn't notice. By 1987, Layne was already carving out a place for himself in Seattle's underground music scene. But fate had something far bigger in store. That year, Jerry Cantrell, a talented guitarist, was struggling in his own right. His band Diamond Lie had just broken up, and he was grieving the recent loss of his mother. Homeless, without direction, Jerry found himself at a party, the kind of party where musicians, dreamers, and misfits crossed paths. And there he met Layne. The connection was instant. Layne was the kind of person who, despite his own struggles, had compassion for others. When Jerry mentioned that he didn't have a place to live, Layne offered him space at the rehearsal studio where he was staying. That generosity sparked not only a friendship but also a collaboration that would alter the course of rock history. It's worth pausing here. Imagine if that night had gone differently. Imagine if Jerry never showed up, or if Layne had been too guarded to offer help. Music history might never have given us Alice in Chains. It's moments like these that remind us how much of life is shaped not by grand plans but by small acts of kindness and connection. For months, Jerry kept nudging Layne to join his band. Layne was hesitant, busy with his own projects, perhaps unsure if this was the right move. Jerry, however, knew what he was hearing. He knew Layne's voice was something rare, something powerful. To prove his point, Jerry began holding auditions for singers right in front of Layne. One by one, candidates tried out. One by one, they fell short. Until finally, Layne couldn't take it anymore. He agreed to join Jerry's band, but on one condition: Jerry had to play in his funk project as well. Of course, Layne's funk band quickly fizzled, and Jerry's project became the main focus. Out of that compromise, out of that reluctant agreement, Alice in Chains was born. This wasn't just the meeting of two musicians. It was the merging of two souls who understood pain, who understood struggle, and who could translate that into music that pierced listeners to the core. By 1989, Alice in Chains had secured a record deal with Columbia Records. For a band that started in rehearsal spaces and local clubs, this was the dream. And when their debut album, Facelift, dropped in 1990, the world got its first taste of just how unique they were. The standout single, Man in the Box, became an anthem. Its heavy riffs, haunting lyrics, and Layne's chilling voice set it apart from everything else on the radio. While Nirvana leaned into punk rebellion and Pearl Jam channeled arena rock energy, Alice in Chains carved out a darker, heavier niche. What made Layne's voice so magnetic was its contradiction. He was physically small, often frail-looking, but when he sang, it was as if a storm erupted from within him. Deep, resonant, raw, his voice carried both power and fragility, reflecting the man himself. But as the band's fame grew, so did the shadows in Layne's life. The early 90s were a time when grunge exploded, and with sudden fame came the pressures of touring, media scrutiny, and exposure to destructive habits. Layne, already vulnerable due to his emotional scars and family history, began slipping further into addiction. What's both tragic and fascinating is how his struggles seemed to seep into the music itself. Take the 1992 album Dirt, for example. Songs like Down in a Hole and Rooster weren't just tracks, they were confessions, cries for help, and reflections of deep wounds. Listening to them today feels almost prophetic, as if Layne was writing his own story before it unfolded. But here's where the paradox lies. The very pain that tormented him also gave birth to some of the most powerful music of the era. Fans didn't just listen to Alice in Chains, they felt them. And much of that was thanks to Layne's ability to channel suffering into art. Real-life example. I once read a story from a fan who said that listening to Layne's music was the only thing that got him through his own battle with depression. He said it was as though Layne was speaking directly to him, saying, "I understand. You're not alone." That's the kind of impact few artists ever achieve. Still, as Alice in Chains rose higher, Layne personally sank lower. Managers hired bodyguards to keep him away from bad influences, friends staged interventions, and fans watched helplessly as his health visibly declined. It was as though two Laynes existed, the magnetic performer on stage, and the fragile man struggling to survive off it. Every great artist has a muse, and for Layne Staley, that person was Demry Lara Parrott. She was radiant, rebellious, and beautiful, the kind of woman who walked into a room and made people notice. But more importantly, she connected with Layne in a way no one else did. They met in the late 1980s, and their relationship quickly deepened. Friends would later describe them as soulmates. It wasn't just attraction, it was a shared understanding of pain, creativity, and the yearning to escape a world that often felt too heavy. Demry wasn't just Layne's girlfriend. She was an artist in her own right, a model, a painter, a free spirit who believed in living passionately. Layne adored her, and she adored him. They even became engaged, planning a life together. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Layne had found stability, something, or rather someone, worth living for. But like many love stories marked by brilliance, theirs carried shadows. Demry struggled with her own demons, particularly substance dependency. Together, their addictions intertwined, reinforcing the very habits that threatened to destroy them. Friends often said they were perfect for each other in love but dangerously matched in their self-destruction. This duality, love and ruin, tenderness and chaos, became central to Layne's life. It's heartbreaking to consider, what if their connection had blossomed in a different time, under different circumstances? Could Layne have found lasting happiness if addiction hadn't wrapped its claws around them both? In truth, Layne and Demry's relationship was both the most beautiful and most tragic chapter of his story. Because while she inspired some of his most heartfelt music, she also represented the fragility of everything he held dear. By the early 1990s, Alice in Chains had achieved fame most musicians only dream about. Their second album, Dirt, 1992, was hailed as a masterpiece. Songs like Wood, Rooster, and Down in a Hole became staples of the grunge era. But behind the music, the cost was mounting. Layne's addictions were no longer a secret. His once vibrant presence on stage was now unpredictable. Some nights he was brilliant, his voice cutting through the air with raw intensity. Other nights, he seemed frail, withdrawn, almost like a ghost of himself. The band's management tried everything. They hired security to keep him away from drugs while on tour. They arranged interventions. They pleaded with him to get help. And to his credit, Layne did try. He entered rehab multiple times, genuinely wanting to overcome the darkness. But as anyone who has battled addiction knows, recovery is rarely a straight line. Still, What makes Layne's story so compelling is the way his pain bled into his art. Songs like Nutshell from the Jar of Flies EP weren't just lyrics, they were confessions, diary entries, cries for help. I feel the pain of everyone, then I feel nothing. That line alone captures the paradox of Layne's existence, feeling too much, then numbing it all away. This wasn't just music. It was therapy, for Layne, and for the countless fans who connected with his words. Many listeners struggling with their own demons have said that Layne gave them a voice when they felt voiceless. His honesty, however painful, made others feel less alone. And yet, even with that gift, Layne himself often felt unbearably isolated. If Layne's life was already fragile, the loss of Demry Parrott in October 1996 shattered him completely. At just 27 years old, Demry died from complications related to her own substance struggles. Her death was a crushing blow. Layne not only lost his fiancée, his muse, his soulmate, he lost the one person who seemed to truly understand him. Friends say he never recovered. His decline after that point wasn't sudden, it was a slow, painful retreat from the world. Layne withdrew into near-total isolation. By the late 1990s, he rarely left his Seattle condo. His once vibrant figure became almost unrecognizable, frail, sickly, and haunted. Those who loved him would visit, but Layne preferred solitude. It was as though part of him had already died with Demry, and the rest of him was just waiting to catch up. Yet even in that isolation, his influence endured. Alice in Chains, though largely inactive, remained iconic. Layne's voice continued to resonate through the songs already recorded, and fans held on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, he would one day return. But Layne himself seemed to know otherwise. In one of his last interviews, he admitted the truth: drugs worked for me for years, and now they're turning against me. Now I'm walking through hell. Those words are chilling, because they reveal not just the struggle, but the resignation. Layne understood what was happening. He wasn't naive. He simply didn't see a way out. It's easy to frame Layne's story as tragedy, and in many ways, it is. But it's also a story of profound honesty. He never pretended to be someone he wasn't. He never glamorized his pain. If anything, he wanted others to avoid the path he had taken. He once said he hated when fans bragged about using drugs because of him, because he wanted no part in glorifying what was destroying him. By the late 1990s, Layne Staley's world had grown smaller and darker. Once a commanding presence on stage, he retreated into near-total isolation inside his Seattle condo. Friends described it as haunting, curtains drawn, little light, with drug paraphernalia scattered around. It wasn't just a home anymore, it had become a fortress of despair. Layne rarely left, and when he did, he appeared gaunt and unrecognizable compared to the electrifying frontman fans remembered. His once vibrant blue eyes seemed hollow, and his body bore the marks of long-term drug abuse. Yet beneath the physical decline, there remained glimpses of the sensitive artist who had once bared his soul through lyrics. What strikes me most here is the silence. For a man whose voice had roared across stadiums, his final years were eerily quiet. This wasn't just drug addiction, it was a slow retreat from a world he no longer felt part of. And perhaps that is the most devastating truth: fame had given him everything, but in the end, he felt alone. Those who loved Layne tried desperately to save him. Bandmates, fellow musicians, and family staged interventions, pleading with him to get help. But Layne often pushed them away, convinced that he couldn't escape the cycle of addiction. His mother, Nancy McCallum, became one of the few consistent presences in his life. She visited him, worried endlessly, and fought to keep him tethered to the world outside his apartment. Friends like Jerry Cantrell, his musical brother in Alice in Chains, never stopped caring, even as their lives diverged. Yet, as heartbreaking as it is, sometimes love isn't enough. Addiction is not a battle fought only with affection, it requires professional care, stability, and above all, willingness. Layne's demons had grown louder than the voices of those who begged him to return to life. This is where Layne's story becomes a mirror for many families today. Addiction doesn't just consume the addict, it consumes everyone who loves them. The helplessness, the frustration, the repeated cycle of hope and disappointment, it leaves scars that never fully heal. By the early 2000s, rumors about Layne's condition were everywhere. He hadn't performed live in years, and his physical appearance shocked. Part 13, the city that raised him, the city that mourned him. Seattle never forgot Layne Staley. For the fans who grew up during the grunge era, his death was not just the loss of a musician, it was the closing of a chapter in the city's cultural soul. Candlelight vigils were held. Fans gathered, not just to mourn, but to sing together the songs that had once been the soundtrack of their youth. Imagine standing in the crowd, hearing hundreds of voices join in on Nutshell. It wasn't polished, it wasn't rehearsed, it was raw, just like Layne's music. People wept, people hugged strangers, and for a few moments, Seattle became united in grief and gratitude. Even today, when you walk through the streets of Seattle, you'll find murals, tributes, and graffiti bearing his name. Layne's spirit has been woven into the fabric of the city, not as a cautionary tale alone, but as a reminder of how art can transcend pain. Time has passed, but Layne's voice still feels alive. Younger generations, many who weren't even born when Dirt or Jar of Flies were released, discover Alice in Chains and find themselves mesmerized by that haunting tone. His music refuses to age because pain, love, and longing are universal. But here's the deeper truth, Layne's voice was more than music. It was a reflection of the human condition. When he sang of falling, of losing, of breaking, it was as if he was telling every listener, "You're not alone. I'm right there with you." That's why, more than 2 decades after his death, his songs still hit so hard. Because they aren't just about Layne Staley's demons, they're about all of ours. He transformed his suffering into something that could touch millions, turning tragedy into art. So, what do we take from Layne Staley's story? Is it only a cautionary tale of addiction, or is it something greater? I believe it's both. Layne's life reminds us of the dangers of silence, of how isolation can swallow even the brightest souls. But his art reminds us that even in despair, beauty can be born. That sometimes the most broken voices can be the ones that heal others. For those who battle addiction, Layne's story is a sobering truth. But for those who love music, it's also a gift, a reminder that even if someone's life is cut short, their art can live forever. Layne Staley may have left us in solitude, but he didn't leave us empty. He left us with songs that still speak, still comfort, and still inspire. And maybe that's the ultimate redemption. Even in death, he continues to remind the world that pain can create beauty, and beauty can create connection. And those who had seen addiction before. Yet, despite his reclusive lifestyle, Layne occasionally reached out. He called friends, sent brief messages, and even mentioned hopes of creating again, though those hopes never materialized. On April 5, 2002, exactly 8 years after Kurt Cobain's death, Layne Staley was found lifeless in his apartment. He was only 34 years old. The official cause, a lethal mixture of heroin and cocaine, commonly known as a speedball. But the tragedy goes beyond the manner of his death. Layne's body had gone undiscovered for 2 weeks. That detail alone speaks volumes about the loneliness of his final chapter. For someone who once stood before millions, adored and celebrated, his last days were marked by silence, solitude, and shadows. And yet, when you hear Alice in Chains today, songs like Nutshell, Down in a Hole, or Wood, you realize that Layne had already told us his fate. His music wasn't just entertainment, it was prophecy. Every lyric feels like a letter he wrote to the world, pleading for understanding while bracing for the inevitable.